There we go. Hi guys, welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight's session, noise reduction in PixInsight. But as always, before we go into that, I'm going to present our image of the week. And I just realized that I didn't send out I did send out the old invite to our image of the week winner, but I did not send him an email. Jason Gonzell, if you're out there and you can't get in, drop me a message or something, and I'll send it so you can get in later in the session. But for now, I'm going to show off your image. This is NGC891, the Edge-On Spiral Galaxy. Beautiful image by Jason, and I do hope that he gets a chance to speak about this image later in the session. I know he intended to come on in. Without any further ado, I'm going to pull my screen back and what did I want to say? First of all, David Ault's presenting on noise reduction in Photoshop. I have posted a link to his presentation and some of the data and tools he's going to be using in his presentation in the description of this event. Start downloading it now as David's getting ready, and that way you'll have it by the time he starts. And basically that's all I've got, so I'm going to hand it right over to David. I'm sorry, today is the Q&A app is enabled, so if you have questions, type them right into Q&A, and I'll call them out to David. But for right now, David.
All right, let me start sharing my screen here. All right, so Adam said he posted this the link to this presentation along with a couple data files. Two of them being images, one of them being a desktop icon file for PixInsight, so that you can try to replay some of the things that I'm going to do here interactively. I put this presentation together, and it's getting kind of long. And the more I went through it, the more I realized that this is a lot of detailed information. I left it in mostly as a reference. I'm not going to go through everything that's in here because it gets fairly involved as you kind of get into details of all the different options for all the different noise reduction tools. But I'll go over a few kind of basics here to start. So the first thing is, we're talking about noise reduction. The question is, what is noise, right? And there's multiple definitions for it. These typically fall into two buckets. There's what we consider truly random variations. These can be something of a Poisson distribution or a Gaussian distribution. Poisson from light being photon shot noise, or Gaussian, which is typical of the electronics in your sensor. And then there's the definition basically says noise is anything that isn't part of the original signal from the target object. And from an astrophotography perspective, the second definition is a little more appropriate as we're trying to expose the object of interest. How we deal with this stuff after that, how we emphasize or de-emphasize structures or things like that, is independent of the data that's coming in, and getting to the cleanest image that we can out of the data we've collected is the goal of doing kind of noise reduction. Depending on what definition you choose, also alters how you represent signal-to-noise ratio. It may be per pixel noise, or it may be object to background noise. There's some good discussions on the Cloudy Nights forum actually about that today. Ultimately, really what you're trying to do, though, is boost the signal-to-noise ratio. You can't really alter the signal, but you can reduce the noise. So that's our goal in doing noise reduction. And you can kind of see over on the right, I've given two histograms, and the first one is an image before any noise reduction is performed. Right? You can see that there's a peak towards the left edge, and there's a large distribution, meaning that there's a lot of uncertainty around that background value. After noise reduction, you can see that pulls in much more tighted. The noise distribution is very confined. So anything along that blue line that I've drawn may have been kind of lost in the noise before, but now it's distinct from the rest of the histogram, so it should show up better. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. The one other point I'll make here is that the best form of noise reduction is to collect better data, meaning from a darker skies, or just gathering more exposure time. One really important element of noise reduction is masking. So I'll quickly cover a little bit of that here. You know, they're extremely powerful, not just for noise reduction, but for other processes as well. And they allow you to regulate how a process is applied to an image on a per pixel basis, right? The mnemonic device typically used to describe them is black reveals, white. That's supposed to be white conceals instead of which conceals. And I'm not. There, that's better. So that means that the darker areas will reveal the data, meaning that whatever process you're running on your image will apply to those darker areas, and the white areas will conceal them or protect them. Right. So you can see a couple examples here. The first one in the upper left is the image. Then I've made some sort of mask that I'm going to apply to that image that's based off of the image itself. And when you apply it, on the lower left you see that image inverted, and then the lower right is non-inverted. So those white areas open up and will allow whatever process you're running to work on those brighter areas. So in this case, it would do something to those galaxies and stars you see there. So here's an example of that here. So I've taken a convolution filter, in this case a 21 by 21 kernel convolution filter. It's just a standard Gaussian point spread function that is applied to the image. With a non-inverted mask from that mask in the previous slide, you can see that the galaxies in the upper image are blurred, right, due to the convolution. But if I invert the mask, those galaxies are protected and the background is blurred. So you can already see benefits of using masking like this, where you can protect the brighter areas which natively have a higher signal-to-noise ratio than the background. So in addition to the noise reduction tools, there are several support tools that can be used. Some of these are for creating or modifying masks, some are for doing evaluations. I'll cover three here directly. The others I've noted, and you know, they'll kind of come up in line, but I'm not going to discuss them specifically. Oh, what is that? Let me get out and stop whatever that is. Okay. Okay. So the extract wavelet layers is a good one. That allows you to go through and break apart an image, you know, based on structure sizes, right? Whether something is 2 pixels across, 4 pixels, 16, you know, 64, or whatever. So that you can kind of identify where noise falls. Do you have noise only on the lowest couple levels? Does it extend up further? Right. So that's a good way to kind of break things apart. The noise evaluation script is another really good one. That one you can actually use to compare results that you get, right? So you might pair that also with measuring full width half maximums to see how your stars are affected by the noise reduction. And range selection is another really good one for creating masks, right? All right. So the extract wavelet layer script is pretty straightforward. Most noise present in images is typically at scales smaller than 5, depending on how you're sampling, right? If you're very oversampled, it may extend up higher than that, but for the most part, what we typically identify as visual noise is below those levels, right? So you essentially specify a target image, the number of layers you want to extract, whether or not you want to extract the residual layer, which is basically everything else beyond the number of layers you've defined, and the scaling function, which I never alter. There's a few options in there, but I just leave it on the 5x5 B3 spline. You hit OK, and it goes off and will give you several images that are labeled layer 000102. One thing to note is that the layer in those labels is actually -1 from what you'll see in the MMT and MLT tools, the multiscale, medium transform, and linear transform tools. So a layer of 0, 1 is equivalent to layer 2 or structure size 4 in those other tools. The noise evaluation script is also very straightforward. It has no form or anything that pops up. It basically runs on whatever your active image is, whether that's a preview or full image, it doesn't really matter. Whatever is active and highlighted, that's what it'll run on. So here you can see I did 2 noise evaluations, one on an image without noise reduction and one with, using the mirror denoise script. And you can see using that script there was a 5x improvement in the background. Range selection is another really good one. It's a very quick and easy way to create a mask for an image, specifically for tools that don't have mask functions built in. It has an interactive preview, so you can click on the small open circle icon on the lower left of the form. And when you start moving the sliders, you'll see in the preview window that pops up what your mask will actually look like. The lower and upper limits work basically as shadow and highlight clipping sliders respectively, so as you move the lower limit up, it will start clipping more of the dark parts of the image. Bringing the upper limit down, you'll start clipping more of the high parts. The fuzziness controls, it's not really a smoothness function, it controls how sharp the edges are around the transition from clipped and not clipped. And the smoothness is basically a blurring function at the end after all the clipping and fuzziness has been calculated. So before I move on, are there any questions, Adam?
I have not seen any questions, and finally got some people in the room, so we're in good shape. But nope, I don't see any questions.
Okay. So there are several tools available in PixInsight for doing noise reduction. I've listed the ones that are dedicated, some that can be used for noise reduction, but are not specifically dedicated for noise reduction. There's a couple in here that are not deprecated, like gray C steration, Utru's wavelet transform. Those are in there for compatibility purposes, pretty much at this point. So I'll go through each of these tools fairly quickly, and then I'll get into a kind of a demo mode, and I'll actually go through some of those using the desktop icons I saved off. So SCNR is really what's called subtractive chromatic noise reduction. Its primary purpose is to remove green noise from images. You know, because we know that 99% of the objects out there in space don't really have any independent green color, we can basically toss it out, right? So by independent, I mean that it's not a blend of blue and green to make cyan, or red and green to make yellow, or something like that. Just specifically green, independent of those. There are some exceptions. Obviously, there are the Hanny's Verwerps. Those are pretty much green, and there's some planetary nebulas that show up as fairly green as well. It's very straightforward to use. You select the color that you want. The protection method, 90% of the time I'm going to use average neutral. There's a few other methods in there, but the average neutral works pretty well most of the time. The preserve highlights option just tells it that you want the same brightness levels after you've run the process as was given into it. And there's an amount slider that basically tells it how much of the result is blended in with the original image. So an amount of 1 means that your output image will be entirely the SCNR result. An amount of 0 means that the result will be entirely the original image. So that's kind of in there in case you're hitting situations where it's throwing off the background. You can get some cases where the background ends up kind of magenta looking, and you can bring the amount down a little bit. ACDNR, that's an adaptive contrast-driven noise reduction. This is generally where most people start with noise reduction in PixInsight. I think that's primarily because this was the first kind of major tool that PixInsight introduced for noise reduction. It essentially works by using a low-pass filter, so essentially a blurring filter, on parts of the image that it deems are low contrast. So that effectively reduces the small-scale noise while maintaining the important structures or whatever it's determining are higher contrast. It has its own built-in masking capabilities, which you can see in the bottom of the form below. There's this lightness mask. There's a whole lot of parameters in here. It's difficult to go through all those, so I'll kind of go quickly on the ones that I typically use. You know, its structure detection is pretty good, but it's not quite as accurate as some of the other algorithms like MMT, and TGV denoise. So it has a tendency to blur some structures a little bit more than some of the others. But the noise reduction overall is quite good. So let me just go through some of the options that you'll probably play with. The apply button, if you look back at the form, just enables or disables whichever tab is active. So in this case, I have the lightness tab selected, so that will turn off and on the lightness application. So you can effectively noise reduce lightness or chrominance separately. The lightness mask checkbox basically turns it on so that whatever settings you've used in the lightness mask section are applied before the application of the ACDNR run. One of the more important ones is the standard deviation. That sets the size of the kernel, or essentially the point spread function of the low-pass filter. This governs how many pixels over an area will be blended together to generate a pixel value. Amount is another really important one. You can see these kind of first three here, standard deviation and amount and iterations, are probably the ones you're going to use most. You probably won't touch most of the other options a good portion of the time. Amount is essentially is a blending of the output result with the original. You can decrease that, to kind of get some blend of the original slightly noisy image, with the noise reduced image. This can be very effective on allowing some of the noise through because you don't want to absolutely kill the noise, you just want to reduce it. Iterations is the number of passes of low-pass filtering that are performed. You can kind of play some tricks by using a smaller standard deviation and higher iteration values to get essentially an equivalent result. The advantage is that sometimes you can get better protection of your actual data using a smaller standard deviation and higher iterations than the reverse. So the others I'll just leave in here for documentation, and we'll move on to the next one. Any questions on ACDNR?
I haven't seen any yet.
All right. I'll keep blowing through these quickly, and then we'll get to the demos here. Multiscale linear transform. This is a fairly new tool. It's multi-purpose. It's not specifically for noise reduction, but it's actually quite good for noise reduction. You can also use it to enhance structures. You can use it to extract wavelet layers. So it's good as an analysis tool or enhancement tool as well. It has its own internal masking tool. I find it kind of limiting, though. I'll kind of show you when I get into the demo mode. But in general, I prefer to use an external mask that I've created separately. Because the structure enhancements can increase or decrease the brightness of certain pixels, they've included a dynamic range extension option. That's just so that you don't truncate the data whenever you do an enhancement.
David?
Yeah.
Tolga is asking what the difference between Atrius wavelets and multiscale linear transform is.
That's a very complicated question. So there's some underpinnings on how the wavelets are actually extracted. Multiscale linear is based on a series of Gaussian filters. I'm not sure how a truce is calculated, but it's a different method on determining how the layers are extracted, is essentially what it boils down to. Functionally, there's actually not that much difference. The multiscale linear transform does a little bit better job of protecting real data than a truce does. It's kind of marginal, but there is an improvement there. So for the most part, I use the multiscale linear transform whenever I'm using this tool. And I've told you that that's not a full answer to your question, but hopefully maybe a functional one.
And has PI depreciated Atrius wavelets for multiscale linear transform, or no?
The tool still exists, right? So in fact, there's two versions of it. So there's an Atrius wavelet and Atrius wavelet V1 for the very first version they implemented. So technically, they're still there, but they're trying to get everyone to move to calling multiscale linear transform if you're using a script, so that it's, they can actually get rid of the previous ones. So if you choose to, you can still actually call a truce directly at the moment.
And Tolga says thank you.
Okay, good. Again, there's a lot of parameters going on in MLT. I'll just go over a few of the kind of base ones you'll be playing with here. You'll be using the layers quite a bit, and the detail layers and noise reduction stuff quite a bit. And you may be playing with the target a little bit as well. The layers just sets the maximum structure size that will be modified, right? So in this case, 5, a layer of 5 corresponds to structures of 16 pixels. The detail layer, X of n, that's layer number out of total number of layers. Those just enable or disable the selected layer. Disabling a layer will entirely remove all structures of that size from the image. So, for example, if you want a really quick blur of the fine-grained noise, you can just disable the first layer, and you'll actually see the image get just slightly blurry, although it's not going to blur the stars or anything too much, but you'll see that effect immediately. The bias is how you control emphasis or de-emphasis of structure sizes. So there's a positive and negative values you can put on there. So positive values will emphasize that particular structure layer, effectively sharpening those structures. This is very similar to a high-pass filter in Photoshop, although you're limited to specific powers of 2 structure sizes. The high-pass filter is more granular than that. The threshold amount and adaptive settings. Oh, sorry, I moved on to the next one. The threshold amount and iterations, sorry, for MLT, are what you'll be working with the most when you're doing noise reduction. Essentially, you're setting these based off of how strong you want the noise reduction. That's the threshold. That's effectively determining how much noise reduction is going to be performed and how the structures are detected. What's actually going to be determined as something that can be noise reduced or not. The amount, similar to other tools, is essentially a blending of the original data with the noise reduced result. And iterations, similar to like ACDNR, just controls the number of passes performed. Also similar to that, you can use more iterations and drop the threshold and amount values, and get sometimes better results that way. The target allows you to define what color space the noise reduction will be applied to. So, for example, you can apply it only to luminance, only to chrominance. It can be applied to independent red, green, and blue channels, that sort of thing.
David, on that note, Greg Schwimmer is asking, not ACDNR specific, but can you explain the difference and importance of managing lightness and chrominance noise independently of each other?
Yeah, actually, we'll get into a lot of that in the functional demos, but because the specific test cases I provided, there's a big difference in the noise profile in the chrominance versus luminance data. In general, the detail that we see in an image comes from the luminance information. Essentially, a black and white representation of the image is how our eyes pick up detail and structure. Chrominance, the color information, our eyes and brain are a lot more forgiving about, right? So we can be a lot more aggressive with how you treat the chrominance data than the luminance data and still get a really excellent denoised result, noise-reduced result. So in general, most of these are separated so that you can treat them separately because generally you want to apply noise reduction differently to luminance and chrominance data.
Awesome. And I think we'll see a little bit more about that as you're going over the stuff, right?
Yep.
Great.
So multiscale median transform, you'll notice that there are quite a few similarities between MLT and MMT. They look almost identical. There's a few minor differences. For example, MMT lacks the K, sigma, and D-ringing options of MLT. This is because the median transform doesn't cause D-ringing, right? So you don't need a D-ringing option. It doesn't need the K-sigma thresholding because the way it calculates the noise is different than what MLT does. So those options aren't necessary, so they're dropped. It still has the dynamic range extension, the linear mask, identical to the other ones. Everything else is the same. The only real difference is instead of iterations, you have an adaptive slider. In general, I like the way multiscale median transform works better than MLT. MLT can sometimes cause dark ringing around high contrast objects like stars. MMT will sometimes cause these dark areas to be placed in the background, kind of like little holes. I find those a lot easier to deal with than the dark ringing problem. So in general, I prefer the multiscale median transform. I also find it a little more forgiving. You can be a little more aggressive with the sliders than you can with MLT. So for the most part, I go to MMT whenever I'm using one of these tools. Like I said, the only real difference is iterations versus adaptive. It's effectively a very similar type slider. The adaptive allows better outlier detection so that you can use stronger noise reduction parameters in there, right? So, you can kind of play with those, use a smaller threshold but a higher adaptive and that sort of thing, similarly to the way you can use a lower threshold and higher number of iterations with MLT. All right, any other questions on MMT?
There aren't any right now, but reminder to everyone out there, you can type them right into Q&A and I'll call them out to David.
All right, so TGV denoise, or total generalized variation denoise. This is one of the PixInsight team's latest and greatest noise reduction tools. It can be a little tricky to use, but when used well, I think the results are a little better than the other noise reduction tools. It does a really excellent job of reducing small-scale noise. In fact, it's easy to go overboard and basically pretty much kill the small-scale noise entirely, which is gives you a very kind of unnatural plastic-looking image, which you don't really want. The sliders are fairly sensitive, so making a small adjustment can make a big difference. So you end up making a lot of small iterations trying to bring things in line and get what you want. It can be used in both linear and nonlinear modes. It doesn't necessarily require masking. It has a local support option that partially services that role. It's not quite the same thing. but masking can still actually be quite useful when using TGV denoise. There's kind of two different ways I've seen TGV denoise used. One is setting the edge protection based off of a standard deviation measurement on the background of the image, and then altering the strength settings until you're getting a reasonable result, and then altering the smoothness to actually tweak how well protected things are. The other method is you leave the strength and smoothness at their default settings and only modify the edge protection setting. For the most part, that's what I typically do. It's a little easier to just deal with one slider, and the results I get are just about equivalent of as using the other method. So in general, that's the one I go for. Like the others, you can operate on the luminance and chrominance separately. TGV denoise works in lab mode instead of XYZ mode. Lab mode uses a lightness and A and B components rather than a luminance, which is the Y component of an XYZ color space. They're very similar though, so functionally it's a equivalent here. Again, there's a lot of parameters in here. In general, I typically work in lab mode. You can use RGB mode, but it locks you into only one set of parameters for all of the color channels. And you may not necessarily want to apply TGV the same way to each of the independent color channels. Maybe your red channel is a lot more noisy than your green and blue. So in general, I use lab mode to deal with those sorts of things. You can enable, disable the lightness and chrominance tabs. Again, the strength slider controls how much noise reduction is performed. Like I said, depending on which approach you take, you may not touch that at all, or you may be using that as a major component of your noise reduction. The edge protection is probably the most important setting, right? Again, depending on how you are going about your noise reduction with TGV denoise, this can be set by doing an actual test on your data, or it can be used as a slider. Smoothness controls how smooth the non-protected regions are. So smaller values will allow smaller scale structures to pass through them, giving you a little more small scale noise in the background. The iterations, this is a very complex process and it can take a long time to run. Generally, I run it on previews of an image and typically start off with smaller iterations. But in general, in order for the algorithm to converge, you typically need somewhere up around 500 iterations. Even then, sometimes it doesn't converge. There is an automatic convergence feature, but again, I rarely encounter data where it converges in 500 iterations anyway. So for the most part, the automatic convergence provides little benefit, and it prevents you from using TGV on a preview anyway. So for the most part, I don't use that option. The local support, there are several options under there. There's a preview, so you can see how your sliders are affecting the local support image. You can select the support image itself. You can do some kind of minor non-destructive noise reduction on the support image in line before TGV runs. This is kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes it provides better results, but not always. And then you have some midtone, shadow, and highlight sliders. These are very similar to any kind of adjustment you make on a histogram, right? Allowing you to do some shadow clipping, highlight clipping, and midtone adjustments on your support image. All right, any questions there?
Eric only has a comment that Harry's Astro Shed has a video tutorial on TGV denoise.
Yep. There's actually some really good ones. Chiron has some pretty good ones as well. There's quite a few ones that are specific to independent tools out there. Mirror denoise. This is a very, very new one. It's in script form at the moment, written by Mike Schuster. This one attempts to understand the mixing of the Poisson noise and Gaussian noise from the light source and sensors, respectively, and essentially makes a risk estimate to determine how it's going to do the actual noise reduction. It requires some characterization of your equipment to work properly, so you need to know the gain, Gaussian offset, Gaussian noise, and the offset of that noise in order to actually properly do the noise reduction. Depending on your how much attenuation you have of your field, you also need a flat field to properly deal with some of that. I put in here, that it only operates on monochrome data. That's actually true, in terms of the data that can be fed it, but you can't actually use color filtered array data. It just has to be separated before you run mirror denoise on it. At the moment, it doesn't really work very well with drizzled images either. Mike has provided kind of a table, for modifying the variance scales based on the drop shrink factors and things like this, but the amount of noise reduction you get out of it is fairly small. So it's not the best option if you're drizzling your data. It can work on a stacked image or a single image. You can see that you have interpolation selections and things like that to deal with what algorithm is used whenever you're registering your data. The results are fairly consistent, so you don't need to know a lot once you've done the calculations. So, for example, your Gaussian noise, offset, and gain aren't going to change a lot. They'll change a little bit over time, but for the most part, they'll stay static. So all you really have to alter is the information about the image. So I think I'll cover most of these in the functional demo. Otherwise, they're a little difficult to explain. So at this point, I have some example images in here. I put these in here for reference because I know that the video feed coming off the Google Hangouts and the YouTube feed is not necessarily the best, so it's hard to see how the noise reduction is actually going. So these are basically some comparison shots of the different tools as I ran them. So you can scroll through those if you download the presentation and kind of see the effects of the different algorithms. And I've put in a couple comparisons in there as well. Okay, so let me go over and bring up PixInsight. So before I get started, are there any other questions, Adam?
I don't see any other questions yet, but I think now is the time you're going to start getting them. Reminder, Q&A, guys, if you want your questions asked. Just type them in and I'll call them out.
All right, so let's do a kind of quick subtractive chromatic noise reduction, SCNR. Like I said, the goal of this one is primarily to remove green. So when I apply it to an image, I'm going to basically say I want 100% of the green removed. Now it's hard to kind of see, but the background, let me actually step up the size of the window. Maybe that'll make things a little clearer anyway. So when I apply this, you'll see that the background color kind of shifted a little bit, and it does look a little more magenta in color. That really has to do with the color balance of the image originally. In this case, it wasn't probably perfectly color balanced. However, you'll notice that the kind of yellow and orangish areas in here, which has green in it, aren't really affected. The protection method does a good job of making sure that green isn't removed out of the areas where the red or blue is brighter than them. But it does a good job of cleaning up everything else where there isn't really supposed to be any green. So that one's pretty straightforward. If I didn't like what was happening to the background, I thought my background was actually neutral and it was the noise profile that was different, I can go through and maybe drop the amount in half, right? And when I apply it, I get some amount of green reduction, but not a full amount. And if I set this to 0, you'd see that basically nothing happens. There's no change.
David, do you use SCNR after color calibration?
I typically use it multiple times during my processing. So once I've done a background neutralization and color calibration, I'll run a pass after that. Sometimes you'll actually need to do another pass after you've done your color calibration. Sometimes it's hard to tell, and the background neutralization and color calibration processes won't work well enough if there's a lot of noise in the image, like there is in this one. So sometimes you end up running it again later on anyway. In fact, I actually have in here that I actually ran. So after I ran the SCNR process, gives me my slightly magenta image. I actually had it set up to do a background neutralization pass to neutralize, make the background more even again, right? So the next one on my list here is ACDNR. So I'll bring that one down in size a little bit. These are the settings I used here, and I'll kind of go through how I set those. The first thing is let's look at the mask. So in order to do, create the mask, you can turn on this preview and then click the real-time preview button. So this gives you an image that you can actually sit and adjust the sliders on. So by default, the midtones are at 5, shadows at 0, and highlights at 1, which basically just gives you an inverted image of your original image. And the wavelet layers are at 0. So it's basically the inverse of my lightness data. You can sit here and play with these things. So maybe I want to protect the galaxies a little bit more. I can bring the midtones up, right? I can also bring the shadows up, which clips what we see as the bright areas a bit more, since the image is inverted. Now you can see that I get kind of speckling and stuff around this tidal tail around this galaxy. That may be fine, but maybe I actually want it a little bit smoother, so I can go through and increase the noise, the layers removed. Now remember I said that you can, in the MLT and MMT tools, you can enable or disable a layer or remove those structure sizes. So this is a functional way to look at that happening, right? So I step it up, it removes all the scale 1 layer. Step it up again, it removes the scale 2 layer, right? So that I'm effectively blurring the background this way. I can also bring up the highlights so that the center of the galaxies or stars are protected a bit more, and make changes like this, right? So that gives me a reasonable mask to deal with. So in this case, the galaxy core will be very well protected. The actual arms here are reasonably well protected, and the background is not protected at all. So whatever I apply, in terms of noise reduction, will be 100% in the background. So now whenever I tick this box, that mask will be applied to whatever whatever noise reduction I do. I'll temporarily disable the chrominance here. Generally what I do is I'll just leave it at the defaults and actually just apply it to my image and see what happens. The image I have here is very small, so I can just apply it directly and get a quick result. In general, though, you'll want to do a preview, like maybe I want to get something around this galaxy, so I can see kind of what's happening, right? So if I apply it and toggle back and forth, I can see what's actually happening there. In fact, it looks like it's doing a reasonable job of smoothing that out. There's still a lot of chrominance noise, but the luminance is pretty good. It may be a little aggressive, as it looks like it's actually blurring some detail and some of the arms around here. So I might back that off a little bit, bring the standard deviation down, or maybe I'll bring it down a lot more and actually bring the number of iterations up. Right. So there you can see that it's protected a little bit better, but still does a good job on the background. Right. So those are the kind of changes you're looking at making, essentially playing with these sliders and values until you get a result that you like. You can also vary the amount. Amount of 1 basically says you get nothing but the noise-reduced result. That's not accounting for the mask, which is also affecting it. So now if I turn on the chrominance, I'm going to disable the lightness, so I only see the effect of the chrominance application. Same type of thing here. You can see the color noise basically disappears in the background, and you get almost a desaturated background entirely. So we're essentially just playing with the sliders again until we get a result that we like. Here I still see a fair amount of color noise in the center, so maybe a little higher, and you just keep making changes like this until you get a result that you're pretty happy with. Once you like it, then you enable both of them if you want to do both, and apply it to your image. And there we go. There's my noise-reduced image. I'll clone it here. Don't know how well this will show up. So there's the original image, and there's the noise-reduced image. All right. Any questions on ACDNR?
I don't see anything in here. Oh, Eric, I'm sorry, is saying, remind us again which of these processes can be run on linear and nonlinear images?
Okay. ACDNR is primarily for nonlinear images. TGV denoise, MLT, and MMT can be run on nonlinear or linear. Mur denoise can only be run on linear.
David, with ACDNR and I'm trying to think which tools, some of them offer that preview circle, so you can preview the data.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find the value in that? Because if I end up setting the preview window to be, I don't know what they call it, high quality or strong, I think it is, or whatever, whatever terminology they use, it doesn't always give me the same result that I'm expecting when it finishes it. Like, for example, yeah, you're previewing the lightness mask right now. If you were to uncheck the preview, and so there at the bottom, quality smooth.
Yeah. So this is yeah. I don't really use the real-time previews for anything but like histogram curves or masks and stuff like that. In general, it's going to be interpolating the data, blurring it, and things like that. So for noise reduction, it's not really useful. I use a preview window like this and just keep applying the changes, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it's something I found. It just I try using it and it doesn't give me the results. The preview window works better.
Yeah, it's definitely because it's basically resampling your image. It basically takes the image and resamples it to something really small,
mm-hmm.
And then whatever size you've drawn that preview window. So let me turn that off and turn this back on again. You can see it working, doing the operation. If I scale this up, it's still using a reduced size image as the base, so it's still going to look awfully blurry. So it's not really good for noise reduction.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes. Alex is now asking, when you have applied to a preview, do you have to undo or do you just reapply? Good question.
You can do either. So whenever you apply to a preview window, it always uses the original data in the preview for whatever you've applied it to. So you can essentially, make a change, apply, make a change, apply, without undoing it. So for example, I'll just do. I'll turn both on real quick. So I'll do that and say, well, I want to do a lot less. So let me drop these values here and try again. So I see a little more chrominance noise. So you can just keep doing it that way. So maybe I'll up this a little bit and up this one a little bit as well. So it's always using the original data whenever you apply it. So you can just apply. There are advantages, if I toggle back and forth, you can see I'm essentially hitting this button here with a keyboard shortcut. There are sometimes advantages for undoing and then redoing, so you could get to see what it looks like from the original data and toggle back and forth. But there are other reasons why you might want to compare a small change between different end results. All right, anything else there?
That's all I saw so far. Yeah, that's convenient. Gives you the opportunity to toggle and to not get confused over which data is which.
Right. So I go back to the original image here, and I'll go over MLT. So the first thing I'm going to do with MLT is make a mask. This can be done pretty easily. I can use the image extract lightness here to create a starting point, or I can use the channel extraction, use the CIE lab mode, and only turn on the L channel also to extract lightness. It's the same thing. You can also do CIE XY and do only Y. This is essentially the luminance rather than lightness. You can see it looks a little bit different, but since we're going to be stretching it, it's fairly identical. So I'll apply that to my image, get my essentially a base point for my mask, right? And then I want to start stretching it. So in general, what I do is I just apply the default screen transfer function stretch. So that's the unstretched data. I stretch it, and then I just apply that to the histogram to get this stretch. This basically just saved that stretch off. So if I reset this and apply it, you can see it will alter the histogram transfer function settings and put in whatever the screen transfer function was. Now if I reset my screen transfer function and apply histogram transform, it'll apply that stretch permanently. Convolution is essentially a blurring function. It's a Gaussian distribution kernel. All this does is blur the image. I'm not sure how clearly that shows up over the stream, but it just blurs the image a little bit. I'm going to take this image and duplicate it. I'm going to name it THR for chrominance because I want to handle the masking of the chrominance separately or differently than the luminance channel. And I'm going to actually do that again. Apply a it's bringing in the white point rather than clipping the white point. I'm going to bring it in so that the brightest part of the image will only be 0.5. So if I move my cursor around, you can see the readout on the bottom around here is like 0.4. The peak of the stars are around 0.45, around 0.5. So the brightest part of the image will be 0.5 after that. Accidentally closed that. All right. And you can see that here that the histogram now ends at the 0.5 mark instead of being stretched all the way across. The reason I did that is because I wanted some more chrominance noise reduction in the middle of the galaxies. If I look in here, there's still quite a bit of chrominance noise, color noise in the center. So I wanted the chrominance noise reduction to work a little more strongly in the middle of those. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually apply my chrominance mask and invert it. So now you can see the galaxies are a little more protected than the background. And then I'm going to run a multiscale linear transform. So just like the other ones, this is kind of a hit or miss process. These settings are very, very aggressive. Normally you don't see settings over 5, but this data has a lot of chrominance noise in it. This was one of my tests where I had, 15 hours of luminance and only 3 subs of 15 minutes each of chrominance data, of RGB data. So there's a big disparity there, right? So there needs to be a big disparity in how I do chrominance for noise reduction versus luminance noise reduction. So I set these settings very aggressively. I'm using a mask, so that will help protect it a little bit. So if I go ahead and apply it, you can see that there is a fair amount of chrominance noise reduction. It has done some desaturating of stars and stuff like that. So this probably needs to be tweaked a little bit. So I'm going to go through and adjust the settings here a little bit. I'm going to cut back everything just a little bit down to 4 and maybe 8. We'll just do powers of 2 here and see what I get. So that's pretty good. Still a little bit of desaturation in this star, but pretty good noise reduction here. And so you essentially just go through and keep tweaking the parameters. Maybe I'll leave this one really high, but I'll start backing these off even more. I'll leave the threshold higher, but bring the amount in. Same thing here. I'll bring this one down a little bit, but leave the amount higher. Make this one 3, make the amount 0.5. So it's this sort of kind of tweaking back and forth. So that change looks a little bit better. It's not quite as aggressive, but the noise reduction is still, chrominance noise reduction is still pretty good. I'll call that good, and then move on to affecting the luminance here. So these are settings that you'll typically see, typically not over 5 for the threshold, and you'll typically see the values, the thresholds decreasing as you go up. That's generally because what we perceive as noise decreases as you go up in structure size. The noise is technically still there at all structure sizes, but what our eyes interpret as noise is typically on the smallest scales. So same type of thing, you sit here and adjust the parameters, maybe bring in the amount or up the iterations and drop the threshold, and then apply it to your image. You can go back and forth. In this case, I think this noise reduction was pretty good. So I don't see much blurring of any structures at all. There's maybe a little bit in this area right in here where I lose a little bit of contrast. But otherwise, the result is pretty good. Yeah, that's partly why I'm losing that. I'm using the wrong mask. So I still have my chrominance mask applied. So if I now apply my luminance mask, so now you can see that the galaxies are protected more. Now if I reapply this, yeah, I see very little change in the contrast in this area. That's a much better result, while I still see about the same reduction in the background. Now, using a set of parameters like this to start with is probably a good place if you want to use MLT for noise reduction. I've seen a few other, values that people use. Some people don't use any iterations. They just, set them all to 1 and just vary the amount and threshold values. That can work pretty well. I tend to like using smaller thresholds and higher, and amounts and higher iterations. I think the algorithm does a little better job of protecting important structures that way. All right, any questions on MLT?
I don't see any other questions.
Okay. So go back to my original image here, remove the mask, and then I'll bring up. Now, I've essentially done the same mask creation with multiscale medium transform, so I'm not going to redo those. Instead, I'll just bring up the tool, and you can see, how there are changes between the different algorithms. In general, multiscale medium transform is less aggressive than multiscale linear transform. However, in this case, however I was approaching the data, I liked these settings a little bit better than the ones I'd used previously on MLT. Again, I'm not sure how clearly this is coming across, but in general, this does a pretty good job of chrominance noise reduction with these particular settings in these images. One of the things I did notice is that MLT did a better job of keeping the color of the stars, where the MMT actually took some of the green noise that was present in the peak of the stars and kind of blends it through. So I end up with slightly greener stars. That's really not much of an issue. You can just rerun SCNR and kill that pretty easily. So I was pretty pleased with that. So I'll move on to the luminance. Again, handle this separately. So I apply the luminance mask here. Make sure it's inverted to protect the galaxies. And again, these settings are a little more in line with what you'll typically see. Not more than 5 are the threshold for the most part. Excuse me. And I like the result I get here more with MMT than MLT. I didn't see any of the kind of dark areas that are sometimes show up with MMT. And it does a pretty good job of noise reduction here. All right. Close those guys out. And go back to my original image.
David, I did miss a question here. Greg Schwimmer is asking, is it worthwhile to deselect the layers and adjust the threshold for each independently? Put another way, how do you know the effect each is having if they're all on?
That's a good question. So, so generally, when I start off with a blank slate, so let's say I'm starting from scratch here with MLT. I'll generate my mask real quick. Just apply these again real quick. Okay. So generally what I do is I work my way up. So I'll leave the first layer enabled, and I'll turn this to 5 layers. I'll turn on noise reduction, and I'll just see, okay, what do I get if I apply that with the default settings, right? So in this case, I'll grab a preview here to make it a little easier. Okay. So if I apply that, what kind of change do I see? And I don't really see much of a change at all. So I'm going to start bringing a threshold up, right? So I start to see a little bit more of a change there with the chrominance. And then I just say, okay, well, I'll stop there. Maybe I'll move to the next layer. Let's set this as half that and see what I get. So I get much better result already just with 2 layers. But I still see some larger scale chrominance noise, so I'm going to enable the next layer. I'll leave it at 3 and see what I get here. That's doing better, but still some larger scale than that, so I go up the ladder again and just kind of work my way up. In general, you should expect, and that alone did a pretty good job of killing it. I probably don't need to go much higher, although I see a little bit of fairly large scale in there, so maybe I'll do one more level up. So that looks pretty good to me. So it's just kind of working your way up. You can actually disable and enable the layers as well. For example, say I want to start again. I've already set my layer 1 to 10 and maybe 2 iterations or something like that. And I want to see just what happens to the second layer. So I'll kill the first layer entirely, and I just want to see what happens on my second layer. Keep exiting out there. And now I'm going to, there's my first layer killed only, and I'm going to enable this and see what I get from there. And that's a pretty good result. So I may change that a little bit. Maybe I'll bring it down a bit. Not quite as good, so maybe a little bit higher. Or maybe I'll leave it at 3 and up the iterations. So that's pretty reasonable. Then I can kill that. So now I have the first 2 layers killed, and now I'm just looking at what happens when I do layer 3. So there's the without noise reduction, with noise reduction. So absolutely, you can go through and work that way. You can actually work on a single layer at a time. So maybe you just want to see only what the first layer looks like, right? So I'll leave noise reduction off. So this is essentially the components of just my first layer. Now keep in mind it's masked, so it's not a perfect representation. If I turn the mask off, and I'll have to stretch it here, this is essentially what layer 1 looks like. Now if I do some noise reduction on this, that killed it entirely. Sorry, I'll go back here. So you can see just a little bit is left in there, some green pixels. So absolutely, you can work that way. At this point, most of the time, I have a kind of a set of parameters that I start with, and then I just kind of make little tweaks on them. So I'm not typically breaking apart all the layers anymore. But you can definitely, if you want to start from scratch, you can definitely go through there and tune every layer independently.
Yeah, and in a follow-up to his question, he's just asking, so there's no need to have noise reduction enabled for all layers, is there?
No, absolutely not. Although if you're not doing noise reduction on a higher layer, then you probably, like for example, say I was only doing these 3, I probably want to bring this down. That just brings the compute time down a little bit.
How about adding layers? Once you get to 5, is there any noise above that that's really going to make a difference?
There are cases where I've done that. Specifically, if I'm doing TGV denoise, and that leaves a slightly higher scale noise pattern, I'll use something where I have a much higher spread, maybe 8 layers, although the application at the highest layers is very low. And then I'll use a really, really strong mask. Something like this guy, I'll actually take and push the histogram peak way over here to the right. So it's highly protected. That way only the really kind of blotchy dark areas are brought up and evened out. So there are reasons why you might want to do that. In general, it's not all the time, though. If you're using MLT or MMT as your noise reduction algorithm, you don't typically see those issues, so you're not going to typically use it like that. All right, any other questions there?
I don't see any others.
All right. So let's see. TGV denoise. Second one. Back to my original image. So this one definitely is a lot of compute time, so it's definitely good to use a preview if you can. So I'll grab the core of that galaxy, and not much else. The kind of title, faint title tail over here. The support mask, or it's not a mask at all actually, the support image is pretty interesting. You know, it's kind of used to drive how the noise reduction is done. You know, so if I apply it to my preview here, this is essentially what my support image will look like. So it's essentially a default screen transfer function stretch, and actually I'll apply it here so you can kind of see. It's a default stretch on the data, so you can kind of see what all is in there. Preview. So essentially, what I always use is a default screen transfer function stretch of my data in here. If it's linear, you know, in this case the data is non-linear, but the midpoint was still kind of low. If I look at the peak of the histogram here, it's at the 1/8 mark, and I really want it up here. So in order to get that up, that's where this 0.30 something number came from. You may also want to do some shadow clipping or highlight clipping, but in general, you know, a default screen transfer function stretch seems to work pretty well there. So once you have your local support defined, then you can get up into the noise reduction part. Actually, I'm going to do the chrominance first because the chrominance is a bigger issue in this image. So I'll use my typical approach, which is I leave the strength and smoothness at defaults. I think this is default set to 2 with an exponent of -3, and I just typically go through, see what this does to my image. So you can see it splits out the lab components L, A, and B, and here I thought that was actually a pretty decent chrominance noise reduction. It may be a little aggressive because I'm seeing some desaturation of some of the stars, so I'll bring that down a little bit. Now this one, obviously, even though I'm working on such a small area, it's much more computationally expensive. So it's looking a little bit better. I'm pretty pleased with that. So now I'll actually go through, turn that off, and turn on luminance and see what I get here. So the default settings are -3 again at 2. Actually, I think this started at 3 here, which was way too aggressive. So I'll leave it at the defaults there and apply it. And I'm applying everything. I'll just let it finish. You can see it really blurred, entirely smoothed the image. Way too aggressive. So essentially, I just start bringing down the edge protection until I'm comfortable with the result. So I'll do that again. Still way too aggressive. Drop the exponent, and you can see that I go from 0.001 down to 0.0001. So it's a whole factor of 10 different. So I'll bring this up. So I went from essentially 0.001 to 0.005. So I basically cut it in half. Try it again. Better, but still a little bit far. Cut a little more than in half again. And that looks pretty good. I'm seeing some good noise reduction there without overly doing it. So now I'll turn the chrominance back on and see what they look like together. That's pretty good. I still see some fine structure along this edge here. The noise reduction is pretty good in the background. Chrominance reduction looks pretty good as I toggle back and forth. So I'll go with that and then apply it to the whole image. It won't take significantly longer since my image is so small in this case. So while this is running, are there any questions about TGV denoise?
I don't see any in Q&A.
Okay. And the nice thing about TGV denoise is it's kind of a one-stop shop. It does a really good job of actually finding and protecting structures while doing a reasonable job of noise reduction. I'm going to push the histogram a little bit here, and we'll see that there is a little bit of modeling in the background left over. So there's the noisy image and the TGV reduction of that. There's some blotchiness in here. That's one of the artifacts. That blotchy pattern is a little bit larger, and typically this is where I will extract the lightness and then use this as a really aggressive mask. I'll bring in the shadows and highlights and then really push this way up. So you can see those kind of dark, blotchy areas aren't going to be protected very well. Apply that as a mask and then use something like MMT with some very aggressive settings. So we'll just do 10s across the board here for the first few levels. Start dropping them down. Now, I kind of know what values are like here, so it may look like I'm pulling these out from thin air, but I've kind of gone through a lot of these passes before. I'll apply this only to the luminance layer. So when I do that, it evens out a lot of the blotchiness in the background. It's not a huge change because the mask is so protective, but it's enough to even out the really kind of dark areas in the background. So in general, when I use TGV denoise, I use it in combination with MMT with a strong mask. All right. So one more algorithm here, mirror denoise. This will launch the script. So I'm going to use test image 2, which is a monochrome image that's been stacked. Actually, let me get rid of this and bring it up so you can see it. So there are 48 images in that stack, and it used the Langsauce 3 interpolation algorithm. This is a crop from fairly close to the middle of the field, and I don't have a lot of vignetting anyway, so I didn't use a flat field. But if you have strong vignetting, you definitely should use a flat field here. These three numbers come from some of the support scripts that Mike has. These are the flat signal-to-noise ratio estimator and dark bias noise estimator. These take calibration frames as inputs. So, for example, I'll give it 2 flats and a dark flat or a bias and run it, and it'll give me an estimation of the gain, what the temporal noise is in the flats, and that sort of thing. Similar to the dark bias noise estimator, I basically give it 2 darks, and it'll estimate the noise, temporal noise, and offset. And then those are used directly here. You use the gain from the flat signal-to-noise ratio estimator, and the temporal noise is the Gaussian noise, and offset values here. So those are really dependent upon the characteristics of your sensor, and once you've set them, you shouldn't really need to alter them much. These two options control how much noise reduction is done, although the cycle spin is more kind of a quality of result setting. Variance really kind of controls the amount of noise reduction. In general, the cycle spin count will give you a better result for more computation time. I think he has a default to 8 and 1. I thought it could take a little more noise reduction, so I set the variance a little bit higher. But essentially, I just go through and you hit denoise, and you'll see it scroll through the different cycle spins. And then it's complete. I'll get rid of this. And there's my noise reduced result. I'll back up this one. So you can see it does a pretty good job of protecting anything that's actually important. So some of the structures in here are well protected. The noise reduction isn't the strongest out of all of them. And generally when I use Mirror Denoise, I use it in combination with something else. So lately my flow has been, I'll start with Mirror Denoise, then do a TGV denoise pass on that data, and then do a multiscale median transform pass on that. So that's essentially what I have here. I have Mirror Denoise, which I've done, then a TGV pass, which really smooths out the image. And then I create a mask from that, so I'll pull this off, create a mask. This is, because the data is linear here, this is multiple steps of stretching here to get this mask. Then I have multiscale median transform, so this is my aggressive mask to even out the background. I'll flip that and apply it, and that evens out the background some. Stretch this a bit more. See that? So you can see some of these kind of blotchy, darker areas in the background even out a bit more. And the result I got here was a little bit too strong. So I actually took this data, backed out all my changes, and then I blended that with the original. So I took the original here and I'll blend this in. So this is a linear blend. I'm taking some percentage of the original image and some percentage of the image that's been noise reduced, and I'm blending them. So you can see that I get some of that small scale noise back into the image. Not a huge amount of it, but a little bit in there. It makes it look just a little bit more natural. All right. So those are all the processes I have. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in Q&A or in chat, but guys, now's your chance.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Yes.
So question, what's your preferred method right now?
My preferred method right now is essentially this flow right here. I start off with a Mirror Denoise, then do a TGV denoise, and then do a MMT on that. And then I typically end up blending some portion of that noise-reduced result with the original. So this flow that I have here is essentially what I'm doing most of the time today.
So you would do that on all your mono channels? Basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, I'd be varying the parameters for each channel before I start combining them and everything. Sometimes I'll actually go through and I'll do Mirror Denoise on the independent channels, then go ahead and combine them, and then do TGV and MMT on the already combined LRGB data. It's just about as effective, and it's a little less work in total compute time and man hours there.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Whether you do that or not kind of depends on where you like to blend in your color data. Some people like to take their color and luminance all the way through a stretch and then combine. So that's just kind of dependent upon your approach.
Awesome. I don't think I've had clear skies since Minoise was introduced.
I know what you mean, Adam.
I thought tomorrow was going to be my night. It looks like I'm clouding out tomorrow, but Tuesday, I think now. But David, is that pretty much all of your presentation?
Yep, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I know I'm going to be going back through that about 1,000,000 times.
Yeah, I know. No, it's a little bit dense, but I wanted to try to kind of cover all the different options that were out there. And sometimes cascading them like this can give you a better result. It's a little risky because you're kind of nickel and diming each pass a little bit as you go, but the results can actually be a lot better than you can get with a single algorithm.
Yeah, well, actually, that last little bit where you pointed out that TGV to noise makes the noise grow, I pointed that out early in the session, or maybe even before the session, makes the noise grow, and then you used the MMT to kind of take care of that larger noise in the background. That was really interesting. That's one that I'm going to go, I know I'm going to be giving a shot. In the room, though, we do now have Jason Gonzell. And if Jason's around and wants to talk about his image a bit, we'd love to have him, and I'm going to pull up his image in the meantime.
Okay. Is there a way you can display that while I talk?
Yes, I'm pulling it up right now. Just bear with me. Oh, I lost it. Well, I'm going to have to pull it back up. Just give me 2 seconds. Let's see here. Sorting through my windows. And it is up. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay. It's not flipping to me when I'm talking. Is it?
If you click my name or TAIC, you'll see your image. On the bottom of the screen, the
okay.
Avatar boxes.
All right. Well, that was a fitting segue because some of these noise reduction techniques I used on this image, the TGVD noise and the MMT cleanup afterwards is something I've come to rely on, especially with this data. For those that don't know, this was my last image that I took with my Canon Rebel T1i. I've recently got the ASI 174mm Cool, and I've been spending all my time trying to put that through the ringer, but I actually forgot I collected these subs back in the early November, so I went back and processed this just a few days ago, and it was a pretty decent result, I thought. 119 frames in total. Something I have to do with this camera to manage the noise because the sensor temperature through most of this was about 25 C. But I will say that pretty much everything in my workflow up to this point has been adapted out of the presentations in this channel, so I think it's pretty fitting that it's selected here as the image of the week. And I could thank everyone by name, but I think if you've contributed here or the beginning and intermediate imaging forum on Cloudy Nights, you're on my list. Also, this image is shot at f10 on a AVX mount, so there's plenty of challenges to get through. I dumped a lot of subs in the process and originally collected about 160, and this is 119. So sum total is almost 8 hours of integration. But yeah, I was pretty happy with the result, and my workflow bounces back between PixInsight and Photoshop now, so I was back and forth probably 4 or 5 times through this process. But I think I've kind of beaten this camera into the ground. I've gotten rid of a lot of the issues it has in this process, and kind of bittersweet because I'm moving on, I think. But thanks for the consideration here for the image of the week. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for submitting. And reminder, anybody that wants to submit their image, there's a thread in Google Plus if you can find it. We'll try and reshare it so it at least pops up on top of your screen. But just submit your images in the comments and you're up for consideration. But thank you, Jason. I'm also seeing one question that I missed before from Greg Schwimmer again. If you are working with RGB data from a DSLR or OSC, David, what do you think your preferred workflow would be with that, or how would it change?
Turn mute off here for a second. So essentially, I would drop the mirror denoise. So I do have a DSLR that I use on occasion, and in general, what I do is I do a TGV denoise and then an MMT only. So those two steps alone are typically my process. I do some blending and stuff in between, you know, along the way, kind of like what I showed at the end. I did one final blend at the end with the original. But in general, when I'm doing that, I have to be a little more aggressive with the noise reduction, so I'm a little trickier with the blending. I'll use actually masks to do some of the blending in between the noise reduced results and the originals to protect the brighter areas a little bit more and things like that.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, it was a great session tonight. There is nothing. I don't have anything scheduled for next week, but I will post it sometime midweek when we come up with it. Maybe we'll have some sort of Q&A on noise reduction, because we have had 2 great sessions on noise reduction this week, and was it 2 weeks ago in Photoshop. So between the two, a lot of info, and I swear, all astrophotographers love noise reduction. It's probably the most popular topic, and fittingly so, I think. But again, thank you, David, for presenting. Thank you all for coming and watching and asking your questions, and we will see you next week. Good night.